Hi, and welcome to the Making the Media podcast. My name's Craig Wilson, and it's great to have you with us. Now, I'm going to start this episode with a question. Do you really know if this is Craig Wilson or not? Have I actually written this intro? Is this my voice? In a world where generative AI is advancing at a rapid pace, who's to say whether this is real or fake? Well, the good news is that I'm real, it is me. But questions such as this are prompting a massive debate within the media world, particularly in news, about the authenticity of content. Now, hopefully you've been listening to the podcast since we started back in 2021. And if you have, then you may remember an early episode featuring Bruce McCormack talking about an initiative called Project Origin. Now, if you didn't, check out the show notes for a link and you can listen later. Project Origin was established to provide a platform for collaboration and discussion among a set of partners on the creation and adoption of a new media provenance tracking process aimed initially at news and information content. At that time, generative AI was nowhere near as advanced as it is now, but questions of trust and transparency were already being raised then. Fast forward to now, and this is why in this episode we're joined by Andrew Jenks, who is the chair of an organisation called C2PA, which stands for the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, and Bruce mentioned that in that episode. In his day job, Andrew works at Microsoft, based in Seattle in the United States, and heads up their media provenance team. We'll get into the detail of C2PA, who's involved, how you can get involved, and the standards they're producing shortly. But first, I asked Andrew to outline his career path and how he got involved in media provenance.
I've been working in the technology industry for about 30 years now in various capacities since I was in college. Came to Microsoft straight out of college, did some language translation stuff here. Moved on to run a startup in Germany for a few years and ended up coming back to Microsoft about 13 years ago, running our DRM teams. Since that time, I've been involved in content integrity in various ways, and came about content provenance really early in its modern life cycle, where we did some work on figuring out how we could protect clear videos for mis and disinformation cases, which led me to the C2PA and everything else that we're going to talk about today.
Do you think there's a link between that DRM background and then wanting to do something, linked to authenticity and how content is kind of perceived and managed?
So less how it's perceived and managed, but more the techniques behind it. Like a lot of the same cryptography that we use in DRM world is applied in this world for protection of clear media, right? It's a different spin on the same problem. Instead of wanting to limit who can see your content, you want everyone to be able to see it, but you want them to know that it came from you or from a certain source, right? And it turns out we use a lot of the same tools for that at a cryptography level. We just put them together in a different order. But it's a very similar problem space in terms of what it looks like. It just has a totally different intent.
So a couple of years ago on the podcast, we spoke to Bruce McCormack. We talked about Project Origin and what was involved in that. So talk a little bit about how things have developed over that time and now what C2PA is, because I'm guessing there are still people within the media business who don't know what C2PA is and really what it's about. So give us a bit of background to it.
Well, they don't know what it is because of our super catchy acronym. We, didn't have branding people working with us originally, so it's the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which was clearly named by consensus. And we just say C2PA for short. So a couple of years ago when Bruce was talking to you, there were pretty much two groups looking at provenance. There was Project Origin, which was specifically focused on mis and disinformation in news media ecosystems. And they were kind of looking from the point of publication where CBC put out a story to the point of consumption, where a consumer was viewing that story and reading the news. There was this other group called the Content Authenticity Initiative that Adobe had started. And they were particularly focused on the ideas of attribution and making sure that creatives got credit for their work. So they were looking kind of from the point of creation to the point of consumption for the creative side. Those two groups heard about each other. We ran into each other at a couple of conferences and we said, you know what? We're solving the same problem. We're just solving different parts of it, right? And if we put this together, we could have one underlying language, one specification that talked to both of these scenarios. And out of that came the C2PA. And the C2PA's goal is solely to produce specifications, standards, and guidance documents to talk about how we discuss content provenance in the industry so that all of the tools we produce to do it are interoperable and can exchange data.
Yeah, we'll maybe come on to talk about the standards in a second, Andrew. But the other thing I wanted to ask there was about the organizations that are involved in both of those initiatives, because obviously the likes of Microsoft, you mentioned Adobe there, you mentioned the CBC, but there are very large organizations who people might think is unusual. They collectively have come together to try to address this issue.
Yeah, we've got folks from all over the media ecosystem because, look, no one company can change how media is consumed on the internet, right? That is absolutely a ridiculous idea. Microsoft can't do it, Adobe can't do it, Google can't do it, Intel can't do it. None of the social networks can do it on their own. So we all came together in C2PA, and all those companies I just named, in addition to Meta, in addition to hundreds of others that I'm leaving out and are going to be mad at me when they actually see this podcast, are involved in that. There are about 300 companies involved in the C2PA end to end, and they represent folks all across the media ecosystem, from folks like Avid to folks running CDNs like Akamai, to folks running dams and other asset management systems, to tech companies, to news companies. And that's just the folks who are involved in the standard, right? Like if you look at CAI and IPTC, which is running Project Origins now, there are thousands more involved in this. Like it's everybody.
But let's talk a little bit about the standards that are kind of involved. So, what is the process that's the C2PA and those involved that have gone through to get to where we are today? And what are the standards that have been developed and are actually currently available?
So, what have we gone through today? So we're on version 2.1 of our specification today. We released our first specification. We were founded in January of 2021. We released our first specification in January of 2022. Since that time, we've expanded what the specification can do. We talk more about how generative AI was used in the editing process. We are more secure, but the fundamental concept behind all of this is that you, as a company, as an entity, as a device, want to say something about the media that you create, and you want people to know that it came from you. So we give you a box, we let you put stuff in that box, we let you sign it, we let you put it in the media, right? That's none of that is rocket science. We just have a really long document that talks about the specifics of how you do that. But that's fundamentally what it is. Like that box travels with the media, and whoever consumes it, whether that be, an intermediary player, a social network, an end user, can reverse those steps, can validate that signature, can make sure that it matches the pixels that were actually in your image or the bits of audio that were actually in your audio or video file, and can see that the signer of that box said those things about a piece of media, right? Like that's it. That's all we've done. We just did it in a way that everybody agrees to.
So, for organizations, you mentioned there that there are, hundreds of organizations involved with C2P and thousands of organizations that are involved overall. For people who want to get involved, how do they do it?
It's a super complicated process. It involves a secret handshake. It actually involves going to our website, c2pa.org. There's a membership link and there's an apply now button on it. We are, I'm going to say, the most open standards body I've ever worked with because I think it's actually true. There is a contributor level membership available for $0. If you want to join, get involved, join the technical working group, and have an impact on the spec. Our specifications are available for free on the web once we consider them to be a version to be done. The 2.1 spec is up on our website right now. You can go get it, use it, and implement it without ever talking to us, and an awful lot of people do. We operate on a consensus basis for voting members if things come to votes, but they usually don't. Like, we are a very friendly standards body, and if you haven't worked with standards bodies before, we're a great one to start with because we are eminently approachable.
So why an organization like Microsoft? It's always a question of like, what's in it for you to be involved in doing this?
Yeah, why is a big tech company trying to do what's essentially a message I'm telling you is good for the world? There's a few different reasons. One of them is, look, sometimes big tech actually does try to do good for the world, right? Like, we have a democracy forward organization that is specifically around protecting elections and democracy. We released tools using C2PA and made them available to campaigns across the world to prevent election misinformation and disinformation. We think that's important. There's also tie-ins with generative AI and our desire to disclose when generative AI is used to end users, right? Because our customers think that that's important. And doing what our customers think is important keeps them using our stuff. Other companies feel the same way. Like, that's the same reason other large tech companies, part of the motivation other large tech companies are involved as well. But at the end of the day, like, look, we had this capability. We knew that we could have an impact on mis and disinformation in society, and we could have tried to build a business off of it. We created an open standards body and gave it the IP so that others could do it because we really do think that, believability of information and a shared reality online is important. Like, we're talking about issues of trust and transparency here, and that's not a corporate sales point. That's just humanity and citizenry needs this.
One of the things that you mentioned there, of course, is generative AI. Now, AI, of course, is a part of the media landscape that is changing, dramatically, and has changed dramatically. I'm sure even since the time when I spoke to Bruce, let's say 2, 3 years ago. So how do you try to address, the changing perhaps requirements that are coming through because of developments like generative AI?
So in C2PA, we actually have a really rapid spec turnaround. We tend to release a new version of the specification every 3 to 6 months or so. That version often talks to changes in the ecosystem around either security or new functionality that's happened since then. Our first version of generative AI, for example, had a fairly limited set of stuff that you could say about what you had actually done. That's expanded quite a bit because it's no longer like the question we're trying to answer is no longer, was this created by AI or not? That that question's passé. The question is, which parts of this image were altered by AI, in what way, at what point in the workflow? And you just need a different vernacular for that. And so we are doing our level best to keep up with the developments in the industry and predict what is coming down the pipeline. But this is an area where I think we as a media ecosystem need to invest more. Like, we're going to need a new vernacular, a new set of language for talking about AI edits in the process of media creation that we just don't have today. But C2PA is trying its best to keep up with state of the art here.
I think it's a really interesting point, Andrew, because I think, well, some of the discussions that we've had on the podcast about, where AI is used, particularly in, production or particularly in news, a lot of that discussion has actually been about, yes, we might use it, but if we're transparent about it and we are open with the audience that it's been used in a particular way, then, that's perhaps one of the ways that it can be done. Is that perhaps some of the ways that you think it's that transparency that's required that actually makes something like C2PA really valuable because you're being transparent all the way through the chain of authenticity?
Yeah, when I talk about C2PA, I talk about it as a transparency standard, which, if you pick up some of the articles that have been written about it, you'll see it talked about as a trust standard. It's not a trust standard. No company decides that their end user is going to trust them or not trust them. That is the end user's decision. That's the consumer's decision, right? The best that you can do as a media entity anywhere in the system is be transparent with the next step and say, look, I did this. Yes, I edited this with AI. It was to take out a trash can, not insert a bomb, right? And let the next person know what you did and why. C2PA gives you the technical underpinnings to be able to provide that transparency.
So we talked there a little bit about, or I use the phrase chain of authenticity, and I think that's a really important thing to talk about because you and I have had a chat beforehand, Andrew, and you mentioned something here that the chain of authenticity can actually start at different points because in an ideal world, it's when someone presses play on the camera, something's being recorded there, and there's verification tools available. But you mentioned to me that potentially it could happen at any point. So to talk a little bit about how you see that chain of authenticity starting, it could start right at the very start, but it could potentially come in halfway through the process.
Yes, but I'm going to back up a quick second before we get there to talk a little bit about the fact that those boxes I talked about being able to be put in content, those can be stacked. And so you do get this chain from step to step to step that forms over time. Um, and you can use that to provide what's effectively well, you can think of it the same way as you think of a police officer going to a crime scene, picking up a piece of evidence and putting it in an evidentiary bag and signing that bag and dating it, right? Everybody who touches that piece of evidence along the process also signs it and dates it so that when it gets to the courtroom, you have this chain of trust for that piece of evidence. We can do the same thing now using C2PA digitally. And so we talk a lot about much what you said. Like it's great if that signature series, that chain starts at the input device, the camera, my cell phone, any of the cameras from Sony, Nikon, like a Canon, others who implement C2PA, any of those sources. But it doesn't, right? Like not everybody has a camera that does this today. Not every newsroom is going to go out and buy new cameras because they can do this. So what are other places that we can think about starting that chain? Well, ingest into a media operator, like a newsroom or a broadcast facility is a great place to do it. Publication is a great place to do it. Like you can sign your work and say, look, you may not know what happened before this, but if you have trust in me, I will transparently tell you, I took care of an authorization process before this, and I am putting my name, my brand behind this piece of content, right? Like imagine Getty Images signing images coming from Getty that say, this came from Getty. If you have a relationship with them, that's probably good enough. And so we can start this chain in many different places. Most media customers, we talk about starting with publication because that's usually the easiest place to hook. They're usually the fewest inputs into it. You want to publish something, it goes into one spot and then it spirals out to many different networks potentially, but you've got kind of a choke point where you have the ability to implement this fairly easily. And then it can be used by downstream consumers.
So we talked quite a lot at the moment about the sort of technical specifications of what sort of sits behind it, and a good description of how it kind of works. But obviously within the media business, there's thousands of people. There's not just those on the technical end of things. So do you think part of the challenge at the moment is actually about an education process for those in the industry? I'm thinking here of, journalists, editors, videographers, people who are creating to make them more aware of the kind of benefits that something like C2PA can offer.
Yeah, and that really goes to the fact that the story we tell differs depending on the audience that we're talking to, right? Technical audience understands that this is a security enhancement. Marketing audience understands that this is a brand protection enhancement. Journalistic audience understands that this is a way of transporting attribution with the material that they create. The interesting thing about C2PA is that it's a Swiss Army knife, man. It's an underlying technology that enables a bunch of scenarios that are really helpful kind of across the board. It's sort of like saying, what is SSL good for in HTTP land, right? Like it's good for an awful lot of stuff. Like when you buy something, you want to make sure that that is a secure connection. When you consume media online, you should make sure that that is media that you know where it came from and that you understand. but the way we tell that story definitely changes depending upon audience.
Is there any competition for C2PA at the moment? Is there anybody else trying to do something similar?
Uh, Not particularly, no. So definitely not in this space. There are some additional specifications that talk to transparency and trust. There are occasionally calls for legislation in various countries that say we should do something about this. So far, we've been able to talk to the folks that have been involved in all of these efforts and say, look, you can try and go do your own thing, but everybody else is over here doing this thing. Please, we'd rather just have you come join us and make sure your use case is taken care of. And that's been a very good strategy so far. Like everybody really wants to get on board with something that's interoperable. And that doesn't work if we fragment the specifications and the standards around it. And so you can look at related standards like JPEG Trust is a good example, right? JPEG Trust talks specifically about how you get trust and transparent media in the JPEG environment. It's built on top of C2PA so that it's also interoperable with everything else. We're currently going through ISO standardization and expect to be made an ISO standard by the mid next year. That turns C2PA into an international standard and opens it up for national standardization across the world. Like we think this is the way forward, and we think that the momentum is clearly behind this effort, and this is how you should go. But I am obviously a very biased uh, operator on that.
The other question I was going to ask, though, Andrew, not something we've touched on earlier, is that are there examples from other industries that are relevant to the kind of work that C2PA is trying to do? You know, I'm thinking here of, you know, we've talked in the past about, you know, AI being used in banking, for example, or being used in the financial sector, or being used in the medical sector. So I'm just wondering if there's experiences from other industries that you've tried to utilize here as well.
So there's certainly some learnings that we've pulled from other industries, particularly other security industries, chain of custody industries, stuff like that. But in general, those none of those industries were doing a great job of protecting their media or the data that they were receiving directly, right? They were protecting the channel, right? Like think of a military satellite talking back to, a government installation. That channel is very highly secured. The material flowing in that channel, not, right? And so most of the high security industries were protecting the channel by which they got the information, but not the information itself. And what C2PA does is move a lot of those concepts down to the level of the content itself. And this is true whether we're talking about video content or any other really kind of binary content. Like we know how to describe authenticity information within that content now and bind it directly to it. So you can secure not just the channel, but also the material flowing through it. That is really commonly referred to as a tenet of defense in depth in the security industry, right? And that's something that we're all striving for is even if bad guys get through one layer and want to do something bad, how do we keep them from getting through all the layers of defense that we have? This is just an additional layer that also has, some other really nice attributes to it and really nice capabilities that makes it desirable.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Andrew. There's no doubt whenever we speak with customers, you know, security is uppermost in their minds across their entire, you know, kind of business network. And the final point I really wanted to come on to is, I mean, ultimately, as creators, you know, journalists, you know, producers, whatever, they are creating content that's going to be consumed. And ultimately, for a lot of people, that's being consumed by a mass audience. Do you think part of the challenge is that the mass audience also needs to be educated about the authenticity of what they're looking at and to ensure that they are cognizant of what's actually in front of their eyes is genuine or not?
Yes, absolutely. And this is the single hardest problem that C2PA has to deal with today, in my opinion, is like, look, none of this matters. None of this matters. If my grandmother does not understand when she is scrolling through her TikTok feed what is edited, what is real, and why she should care, right? If we can't come up with UX and UI to communicate that in ways that the average person understands, it doesn't matter how much technical data goes in. It'll still do some good things for the industry. That's awesome. At the end of the day, when you start talking about mis and disinformation, it is a general populace problem. We need better media literacy across the world. We need public-private partnerships for that. We need government involvement for that, right? Like the fact that media has progressed to the degree that it has, and the media literacy that we're teaching, my kids, the world's kids, hasn't changed in a really long time is a problem. Like we see that over and over again in our digital world. And this is just another example of needing to educate people on what's happening.
So what's next for C2PA then? What's on your agenda for the next 3 to 6 months?
Oh my goodness. It's a lot of outreach and attribution. We're seeing a lot of work in the legislative sector around generative AI, and we want to make sure that generative AI disclosure is considered as part of that. So it's an awful lot of education of legislators and lawmakers. It's also additional technical work, additional security work on the specification to make sure that we stay state of the art. A lot of it is around that educational piece. We're putting a large chunk of money from grants from a few companies into education of enterprises and other customers so that they know some of the new capabilities that are available to them. And of course, outreach, right? We're making sure that the companies like the Avids of the world have this built into their tools so that your customers can pick up that capability as well through tools that they already use.
Yeah, well, hopefully this discussion and promotion of the podcast will help people become more informed about C2PA. And so if they haven't heard about it before, they're a lot better informed now, hopefully after the last 25 minutes than they were at the start. So Andrew, thanks a lot for that. There is a final question, which I've asked everyone on the podcast, so I will ask you as well. And that question is, what is it, if anything, that keeps you up at night?
Keeps me up at night. Craig, there's a list about a mile long. Probably the most concerning for me right now is a set of topics around generative AI. Like we're getting to the point where you can generate material that is pixel for pixel identical to that captured by cameras. That to me creates a world, an online world in which you no longer know if what you're looking at is real or generated. And that means that, situations that we used to have in the past, like you and I doing this interview in a room where I would know that those medals behind you were real. I don't actually know that those weren't generated, right? Like you might be faking that background. I don't know. That contributes to a world in which we no longer have a shared online reality. And that creates tremendous societal problems and pressures. That's probably my biggest concern is how do we address that? Which conveniently, C2PA is one of the ways that we address that, but that is probably what I'm most worried about in the media ecosystem today.
We undoubtedly live in a world where there are many great advances, but also threats. Thanks to Andrew for giving us an update on the work of C2PA. Now, to find out more, check out the show notes where there's a link to the C2PA website, the episode with Bruce McCormack, which I mentioned earlier, and an article about Avid's involvement in this area. You can follow Avid's social channels to get the latest updates on all our products and solutions, including our work on AI and the approach we are taking at implementing it through our Avid ADA framework. Now, this is the final episode of the Making the Media podcast for 2024. We're going to take a little break and we'll be back early in the new year. Thanks again to Andrew and in fact to all of the guests who've given their time so generously to join us over the past 12 months. Thanks as always to our producer Matt Diggs, but mostly thanks so much to everyone who's listened into the podcast. Hopefully you find the series informative and enjoyable. From now, from me, Craig Wilson, yes, it really is me, Craig Wilson, it's goodbye, and I look forward to 2025 with more of the people involved in making the media